Miss Marple and the Murder of the Baker's Son. Chapter 1. Dawn Loaves and a Cry. The village of St. Mary Mead lay wrapped in the particular stillness that comes just before dawn, when even the most persistent cockerel has not yet found his voice. Yet in one corner of the high street where Tranta's bakehouse stood with its cheerful yellow brick and small-paned windows, there was already life and movement. Edwin Tranta had been awake since 3, as was his custom. At 62, he moved with the careful precision of a man who had spent 40 years measuring flour by handfuls and judging the heat of an oven by the color of its glow. His weathered face bore the perpetual flush of one who worked near fire, and his hands, though scrubbed clean each evening, carried the permanent dusting of flour beneath the nails that marked his trade. The bakehouse proper lay behind the shop, a long, low-ceilinged room dominated by the great brick oven that had served 3 generations of Tranters. Along one wall ran what Edwin called the oven line, the stone-topped bench where the long wooden peels rested, ready to slide loaves in and draw them out again. The air was thick with the honest smells of yeast and warmth, underscored by the faint, pleasant smokiness that clung to the old bricks. By 3, Edwin's son, Ned, had joined him. At 19, the boy moved with the quick efficiency of youth, his fair hair already showing the premature dusting that came from working in flour. Ned had his father's careful ways, but where Edwin was methodical from long habit, Ned was methodical from nature. He kept lists and schedules, timing the proving to the minute, marking irregularities in a small notebook he carried in his apron pocket. "Morning, Dad," Ned called, tying his apron strings with practiced movements. "I've checked the proving cupboard. The morning batch should be ready by 4:25. Edwin nodded with satisfaction. The boy had a head for the business, no doubt about that. Better than Edwin himself had been at that age, when he'd been more interested in the village girls than the proper temperature for proving dough. From the back room came the softer sounds of Connie Darren's preparations. Miss Darren rented the small chamber behind the main bakehouse for her confectionery work, and her reputation for wedding cakes and sugar work extended well beyond St. Mary Mead. She was a neat, self-contained woman of perhaps 40, with dark hair pulled severely back and hands that moved with the delicate precision of her craft. The arrangement suited everyone. She needed the proper ovens for her more elaborate work, and Edwin was glad of the extra income the rent provided. "Good morning." "Miss Darren," Ned called through the connecting door. "Good morning, Ned." Her voice carried the faint reserve she maintained with everyone. "I'll be working on the Petton wedding cake this morning. The sugar roses need to be set today if they're to be ready for Saturday." The front of the shop remained in darkness, but Edwin knew that by 6 cow Kitty Larkin would arrive to arrange the window display and prepare for the 7 cow opening. Kitty was a cheerful girl of 21 with brown curls that refused to stay entirely tidy beneath her cap and a ready smile for the customers. She and Ned had an understanding, though nothing formal had been announced. Edwin approved. The girl had sense and wasn't given to silly airs. At 4:00 precisely, Ned began his morning routine. First, he checked the temperature of the main oven by holding his hand briefly in the opening. Not too close, but near enough to judge the heat. Then he moved to the proving cupboard, a tall wooden cabinet that stood near the back wall, warmed by pipes from the boiler. The morning's bread had been set to prove the night before, and by now the loaves should have reached exactly the right degree of lightness. Edwin was in the yard behind the bakehouse, loading the morning's delivery baskets into the handcart. The dawn rounds were Ned's responsibility. He had a good head for remembering who took what, and the housewives liked his polite manner. Mrs. Pargeter at Gossington Hall always wanted her loaves delivered before 7, while Miss Marple preferred hers later, around 9. With the morning post, the village was beginning to stir. Through the bakehouse windows, Edwin could see the first faint lightening of the sky, and somewhere a blackbird had begun its tentative morning song. In another hour, the comfortable bustle of St. Mary Mead's daily life would begin in earnest. Ned moved with his customary precision along the oven line, checking each batch of loaves. The long wooden peels leaned against the wall within easy reach. 5 feet of smooth ash wood, worn smooth by countless hands and seasoned by years of heat. Each peel was balanced perfectly for its work, heavy enough to carry substantial loads, but light enough to maneuver quickly in the intense heat of the oven mouth. At 10 minutes past 4, Alec Purvis arrived, though his visit was unexpected. Purvis represented the Much Benham Mill and held the credit for Edwin's flour supplies. He was a man of perhaps 50, with thinning hair slicked back, and a manner that managed to be both jovial and somehow unpleasant. His clothes were always neat, his hands always clean, and Edwin had never entirely taken to him, though the business relationship was necessary and on the surface cordial. Morning. "Edwin," Purvis called out with his habitual bonhomie. "Thought I'd look in early. Wanted to discuss that new line of fancy flowers for Miss Darren's work." Edwin grunted a response, not entirely pleased by the interruption to his routine. The morning's work had its own rhythm, and visitors, even business visitors, disturbed that rhythm. From the proving cupboard came a soft thud as Ned checked the morning batch. "Ready to go, Dad?" he called. "Temperature's perfect." Edwin nodded and continued loading the delivery baskets. In 15 minutes, the first loaves would go into the oven, and by 7:00, the shop would be filled with the sight and smell of fresh bread. It was a rhythm that had sustained the Tranta family for 3 generations, as regular and dependable as sunrise itself. But this morning, that ancient rhythm was about to be shattered forever. At exactly 20 minutes past 4, a thin cry cut through the warm, flour-laden air of Tranta's bakehouse, a cry that brought neighbors running, and would bring Inspector Slack grumbling from his bed within the hour. The peaceful morning of St. Mary Mead had suddenly become something far more sinister. Chapter 2. A Blow by the Oven Line. By 4:20, Tranta's bakehouse had become the center of a small but growing crowd. Word travels fast in St. Mary Mead, and the thin cry that had pierced the morning air had brought first Mrs. Clement from next door, then old Mr. Petherick from across the way, and finally a steady trickle of early risers who had heard the commotion and come to investigate. Edwin Tranta sat on a flour sack in the corner of the bakehouse, his face gray with shock and his hands trembling despite his efforts to steady them. Before him, on the warm flagstone floor beside the oven line, lay his son Ned, motionless and pale in the growing daylight that streamed through the east-facing windows. Dr. Haydock had arrived within minutes of being summoned, his medical bag in one hand and his coat thrown hastily over his nightshirt. He knelt beside the young man with the brisk efficiency of long practice, his weathered hands moving carefully over the still form. The examination was thorough but brief, and when he stood, his expression was grave. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he said quietly to Edwin. "The boy's gone. Single blow to the left temple. Quite severe. The fracture extends—" He paused, glancing around at the gathered faces. "Well, it would have been instantaneous, Edwin. He wouldn't have suffered." Inspector Slack arrived just as the church clock was striking the quarter hour, his uniform hastily donned and his manner irritable at being roused from his bed so early. Slack was not a man who enjoyed having his routine disrupted, particularly not by what appeared to be a straightforward accident in a bakehouse. "Right then," he announced, surveying the scene with the air of a man who had seen it all before. "Everyone who doesn't belong here, out. This is official police business now." He waited while the curious neighbors reluctantly dispersed, then turned his attention to the immediate area around the body. The long wooden peel lay half under the bench beside the oven line, its smooth ash handle gleaming dully in the morning light. The business end, the flat paddle used for sliding loaves in and out of the oven, rested on the flagstones near Ned's head. Slack examined it without touching, noting the position and angle. "Clear enough what happened?" he declared after a few minutes' observation. Lad was working the morning shift. Floors slick with flour dust as always. Turns too quick with that great long paddle in his hands. Feet go out from under him and down he goes. Dangerous things, those peels swinging about in a confined space. Surprised it hasn't happened before, frankly. Dr. Haydock frowned slightly. The injury pattern is rather odd for a simple fall, Inspector. The fracture shows evidence of a blow from something. Flexible but heavy, almost. As if the peel had swung like a pendulum rather than simply falling with the boy. Slack. Waved this observation aside with the confidence of a man who preferred simple explanations to complex ones. Probably caught him on the way down. These accidents happen fast. No telling exactly how things fall or swing in the moment. It was at this point that Miss Jane Marple appeared in the doorway of the bakehouse, her gray hair neatly arranged despite the early hour, and her keen blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. She'd been out for a customary early walk, a habit she had maintained for years, finding that the morning air cleared her thoughts, and the quiet streets allowed her to observe the daily patterns of village life. "Oh my," she said softly, taking in the tragic tableau. Poor young Ned, such a careful boy too, always so precise with his timing and measurements. Edwin looked up at her with the expression of a drowning man clutching at driftwood. "Miss Marple, I don't understand it." Ned knew every inch of this bakehouse. He'd worked here since he was 12, never had so much as a burned finger in all that time. "Accidents will happen," Slack said firmly, "especially when people get overconfident. The lad probably thought he could manage that peel with his eyes closed." Miss Marple moved carefully around the edge of the scene, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the flagstones. She had a way of making herself nearly invisible when she chose to, and Inspector Slack, busy with his examination of what he considered the relevant facts, paid her little attention. "The floor does seem rather treacherous," she observed mildly, noting the fine coating of flour that dusted the stones. But even as she spoke, her nose was catching something else, a sweet, slightly bitter scent that seemed out of place among the honest smells of bread and yeast. It was faint but distinct, like caramelized sugar that had been heated just past the point of perfection. She paused near the wall where several wooden pegs jutted out at various heights, practical fixtures for hanging aprons, towels, and the dozen small tools that made up a baker's equipment. On one peg, about 5 feet from the ground, something caught the morning light with an amber gleam. Miss Marple withdrew a small lace handkerchief from her sleeve and gently touched it to the peg. When she examined the handkerchief, a small bead of what looked like honey clung to the lace, but it was harder than honey, more like crystallized sugar. She held it to her nose and caught again that faint, burnt sweetness. "Curious," she murmured to herself. Inspector Slack had moved on to questioning Edwin about the morning's routine. "So you were in the yard loading baskets from 4:10 until you heard the cry?" "That's right," Edwin confirmed, his voice hollow. "Same as always." Ned was checking the proving cupboard. Had his schedule written out, you know, very particular about timing. The morning batch was due to come out of proving at 4:25, and Miss Darren, Connie Darren, stepped forward from where she had been standing quietly near the door to her workroom. "I was upstairs in my room finishing some sugar work for a wedding cake. I heard the cry and came down immediately." Slack nodded, making notes. Simple enough. Everyone occupied with their own tasks, the lad working alone, accident waiting to happen. But Miss Marple was still examining the peel itself, though from a respectful distance. The handle, she noticed, bore a curious mark about 2/3 of the way down its length, a faint impression as if something had been wound tightly around the wood and then suddenly released. The pattern was too regular to be accidental damage, too fresh to be old wear. Moreover, when she looked up at the ceiling above the oven line, she could see a small iron hook that had been installed there for hoisting sacks of flour to the storage loft. The metal showed a bright rub mark, as if something had passed over it recently under tension. "Dr. Haydock," she said gently, "you mentioned that the blow seemed to come from something flexible but heavy. Might I ask what you meant by that?" The doctor glanced at Inspector Slack, who was clearly growing impatient with what he saw as unnecessary complications. "Well, Miss Marple, the injury pattern suggests the weapon, if I may call it that, had some give to it when it struck. Not like being hit with a poker or a piece of iron, but more like, well, like being struck by a weighted rope or perhaps a flexible rod under tension." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I see, and the angle of the blow?" "Slightly downward. From about the height, a man might swing a cricket bat, but with much more force than human muscles alone could generate." Inspector Slack had heard enough. "Gentlemen, ladies, I think we're making this far more complicated than it needs to be. Tragic accident, nothing more. The coroner will confirm it. Mark my words. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to arrange for the body to be moved and get statements from everyone who was here this morning." As the inspector began his official procedures, Miss Marple took one more careful look around the bakehouse. Near the proving cupboard, she noticed a kettle sat on a small gas ring, still warm, though not actively steaming. The positioning struck her as odd. It was placed so that any steam would rise directly toward the wall, where it would serve no obvious purpose. She made no comment, but filed the observation away, with the burnt sugar smell, the amber bead on the peg, and the curious mark on the peel handle. In her long experience, it was often the small inconsistencies that told the largest truths. The morning sun was fully up now, streaming through the bakehouse windows and highlighting the flour dust that danced in the air. It should have been a scene of honest industry, the daily rhythm of bread making that had sustained the village for generations. Instead, it had become a place of tragedy and unanswered questions. Edwin Tranta would not be baking bread this morning, and Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that young Ned's death had been anything but the simple accident Inspector Slack was so eager to declare it. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices Burnt Sugar. The removal of poor Ned's body had been accomplished with as much dignity as such things allow, and Inspector Slack had departed with the confident air of a man who considered his work essentially complete. Dr. Haydock had lingered only long enough to offer Edwin a mild sedative, which the baker had refused with the stoic determination of a man who preferred to face his grief clear-headed. Miss Marple remained ostensibly to offer what comfort she could to the bereaved father, but in reality because something about the entire scene continued to trouble her in ways she could not yet articulate. She had learned over many years of observing human nature to trust these inexplicable feelings of unease. "Perhaps I might help tidy up a bit," she suggested gently to Edwin, who sat staring at the spot where his son had fallen. "It's often easier to think clearly when things are in their proper order." Edwin nodded absently, and Miss Marple began to move quietly about the bakehouse, ostensibly straightening and organizing, but in fact conducting a much more thorough examination than Inspector Slack's cursory investigation had encompassed. The proving cupboard drew her attention first. It stood slightly ajar, as Ned had left it when he made his final check of the morning's bread. The wooden door was warped with age and steam, and Miss Marple noticed that someone had wedged a small wooden peg into a crack in the door frame, presumably to prevent the door from swinging shut and disturbing the delicate proving process. The kettle on the gas ring nearby had cooled considerably since her earlier observation, but its positioning still struck her as deliberately placed rather than casually set down. She examined the small blue flame beneath it and noted that the gas was still turned on, though quite low. The steam that would have risen from the kettle spout would have traveled in a direct line toward the wall, where it would have encountered the wooden peg she'd noticed earlier, the one with the curious amber deposit. Moving to Connie Darren's corner of the bakehouse, Miss Marple's attention was caught by a small copper saucepan sitting in a basin of soapy water. The pan bore the telltale brown staining of caramelized sugar around its rim, and when she leaned closer, she could detect that same faintly bitter sweetness she'd noticed earlier. "Miss Darren?" she called softly to the confectioner, who was standing uncertainly near her workroom door. "I hope you don't mind my asking, but this little pan, were you making caramel yesterday evening?" Connie approached with her characteristic measured step. She was a woman who never seemed to hurry, though Miss Marple had noticed that her movements, while deliberate, were also remarkably efficient. "Danish glaze," she replied precisely. "I prepared it yesterday for some pastries. The sugar work for wedding cakes requires rather exact temperatures, you understand?" Miss Marple nodded with interest. "How fascinating. I confess, I've never quite mastered the art of sugar work myself. All those different stages, soft ball, hard crack, and such. It seems so scientific." "It is, rather," Connie agreed, with the first hint of enthusiasm she had shown all morning. "Sugar is quite predictable once you understand its nature. Each temperature produces a specific consistency. Hard crack, for instance, occurs at precisely 305 degrees. Any cooler and the sugar remains pliable. Any hotter and it begins to burn." Miss Marple examined the rim of the saucepan more closely. The brown residue was indeed characteristic of sugar heated to the verge of burning, but there seemed to be rather more of it than one would expect from a simple glaze preparation. Moreover, when she touched the rim with a handkerchief, several thin threads of what appeared to be twine came away, embedded in the hardened caramel like insects in amber. "How odd," she murmured. "These little threads, did they fall in accidentally while you were working?" Connie's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Sugar work can be quite messy. One uses whatever materials are at hand to test the consistency. Baker's twine serves as well as anything for dipping tests. Miss Marple returned to the wall peg that had first caught her attention. In the growing daylight, the amber bead was even more pronounced, and she could now see that it was not simply a drop of hardened syrup, but rather the remains of what had once been a small loop or knot. The twine fibers embedded in it were coarse and practical, the sort used for tying sacks or bundling deliveries. She followed an imaginary line from the peg to the ceiling hook she had noticed earlier. The distance was perhaps 8 feet, and the angle would have allowed something suspended from the hook to swing in a controlled arc toward the oven line where poor Ned had been found. "Edwin," she said gently, "that hook in the ceiling, what is it ordinarily used for?" The baker looked up with effort, following her gaze. "Hoisting sacks to the storage loft. Haven't used it in months, though. Too much trouble getting the pulley rigged up for just the two of us." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The hook showed that curious bright rub mark she had observed earlier, as if a rope or cord had passed over it under considerable tension. Below it, on the flagstone floor, she discovered something that Inspector Slack had missed in his hurried examination. A small glass-hard fleck that had clearly fallen from above and shattered on impact. When she held it to her nose, it carried that same burnt sugar scent. The positioning troubled her. If someone had been working with hot sugar at Connie's bench, how had fragments come to fall near the oven line? Sugar work was precision business. One did not carry boiling syrup about carelessly. She moved to examine the peel handle more carefully. The mark she'd noticed was definitely the impression of cord or rope, wound tight and then suddenly released. The wood showed a slight depression where something had pressed against it with considerable force, and there were faint scorch marks as if heated sugar had come into contact with the handle. "Miss Darren," she said, returning to the confectioner, Might I ask what time you finished your sugar work yesterday evening? Rather late, Connie replied. The Pettin wedding cake requires quite elaborate decorations. I was working until nearly midnight, I believe. And this morning, you were in your room upstairs when the accident occurred? Yes, I was putting the finishing touches on some sugar roses. They're quite delicate work. They must be handled when the humidity is just right, you understand? Miss Marple did understand, but she also understood that sugar roses were typically made days in advance to ensure they had time to harden properly. Moreover, the confectioner's shoes, she noticed, were remarkably clean for someone who had been working in a bakehouse environment during the early morning hours. Edwin's boots showed the honest coating of flour and ash one would expect, but Connie's neat black shoes might have come fresh from the box. The kettle drew her attention once more. Its placement was so precise, so deliberately angled, that it seemed to serve a specific purpose beyond the simple boiling of water. When she traced the path its steam would have taken, it led directly to the peg where she had found the amber residue. How very interesting, she murmured to herself. Steam, she reflected, was remarkably useful in sugar work. It could be used to keep chocolate at working temperature, to prevent crystallization in fondant, or to soften hardened caramel. But what possible purpose could it serve when directed at a wall peg 8 feet away from the confectioner's workstation? Unless, of course, the peg itself was not merely a storage fixture, but part of some more complex arrangement. Miss Marple stood very still in the center of the bakehouse, her mind working through the implications of what she had observed. The burnt sugar smell that had first caught her attention was growing stronger as the morning warmed, as if heat was releasing trapped aromas from various surfaces. The flagstones themselves seemed to hold traces of that characteristic sweetness. "Edwin," she said finally, "I wonder if you might show me exactly how Ned would have conducted his morning routine. The timing, the sequence of tasks, everything just as he would have done it." Edwin looked at her with puzzlement, but also with the faint hope of a man grasping for understanding in the face of senseless tragedy. "I suppose, well, he had it all written down, you know. Very methodical was Ned. Had a schedule posted right there by the door." Miss Marple examined the neat chart in Ned's careful handwriting. Every task was timed to the minute, every procedure laid out in precise order. At 4:27, according to his schedule, he would have checked the proving cupboard and adjusted the door position if necessary. 27. Exactly 3 minutes after the thin cry had pierced the morning air. The timing, Miss Marple realized, was far too precise to be coincidental. Chapter 4. 2 Glazes on a Bun. By 7 Tau, the regular rhythm of village life had begun to reassert itself, despite the morning's tragedy. The postman had made his rounds. Mrs. Clement had opened her cottage garden to catch the morning sun, and the first customers were gathering outside Tranta's bakehouse. Uncertain whether the shop would open, but hopeful that some bread might still be available. Edwin, roused from his stupor by the practical necessity of dealing with his customers, had managed to salvage most of the morning's baking. The loaves that had been proving when Ned died were slightly over-risen, but still serviceable, and with Miss Marple's quiet assistance, he had gotten them into the oven before they were entirely spoiled. Kitty Larkin had arrived promptly at her usual time, taking one look at Edwin's haggard face and immediately setting about the familiar tasks of arranging the shop window and preparing the front counter. Her brown curls were particularly unruly this morning, as if she had dressed in haste, and her eyes were red-rimmed with weeping that she tried valiantly to conceal. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, when the elderly lady appeared in the shop doorway. "I can't believe he's gone. Just yesterday evening, he was telling me about his plans for improving the delivery routes, making everything more efficient. He had such ideas about modernizing the business." Miss Marple purchased a Chelsea bun from the display case, noting with interest that while most of the pastries bore the characteristic double sheen of Connie Darren's careful finishing work, Several items showed only the basic egg wash that would have been applied before baking. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable to an experienced eye. "These buns are particularly fine," she observed to Kitty. "Miss Darren's sugar work is quite artistic." Kitty glanced toward the bakehouse where Connie could be seen moving about her usual morning tasks with her customary precision. "She's very particular about her finishes. 2 glazes on most things. First the egg wash before baking, then her special syrup glaze after. Makes everything look like it belongs in a London bakery window." Miss Marple examined her Chelsea bun more closely. It was indeed beautifully finished, with the golden glow of egg wash underneath and the brilliant shine of sugar syrup on top. But one bun on the same tray caught her attention. It bore only the matte finish of egg wash, and across its surface someone had scored a neat cross with a knife point. "How curious," she murmured. "This one seems to have been marked differently." Kitty leaned over the counter to see what Miss Marple was indicating. "Oh, Ned did that yesterday evening after Miss Darren had finished her glazing. He'd been keeping track of irregularities. He said something about the sugar accounts not adding up properly." "Irregularities?" "Well," Kitty lowered her voice conspiratorially, "he thought someone had been taking sugar and making up the difference with that cheap glucose syrup. 2 glazes tell lies," he said. I didn't quite understand what he meant, but he seemed quite concerned about it. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. In her experience, young men who kept careful records and noticed discrepancies often found themselves in uncomfortable positions. "Did he mention this concern to anyone else?" "He was planning to speak to his father this morning. He'd been making notes in that little book of his. You know how methodical he was about everything. Said he had proof that the sugar inventory wasn't matching the actual usage." From the till area came a soft, rustling sound as Kitty began organizing the morning's receipts. Among the papers, Miss Marple glimpsed a small notebook with Ned's careful handwriting. The page was open to what appeared to be a list of glazed items, and beside several entries were pencil notations in the margin. "Might I see that notebook for a moment?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I'm trying to understand Ned's system. He seemed such an organized young man." Kitty hesitated only briefly before handing over the notebook. The entries were meticulously detailed, recording not just what items had been prepared for glazing, but noting discrepancies between the amount of sugar that should have been used and what actually appeared to have been consumed. Beside the previous day's glaze list, Ned had written G4 in his neat script. G for glucose, perhaps? Miss Marple suggested. Could be. He mentioned that glucose gives a different sort of shine, brighter but somehow false-looking. Said an experienced baker could tell the difference if they knew what to look for. Miss Marple turned back toward the bakehouse, where Edwin was mechanically going through the motions of his trade, while Connie Darren worked at her bench with her usual quiet efficiency. The contrast between the two was striking. Edwin's movements showed the disruption of grief and shock, while Connie seemed almost unnaturally composed. "Kitty," she said carefully, "you work closely with Miss Darren on the finishing work. Have you noticed anything unusual about her methods recently?" The girl considered this seriously. "Well, she's been using rather more sugar than usual. She ordered extra granulated just 2 days ago, and a drum of glucose as well. Said it was for a special wedding commission, but..." She paused, glancing around to ensure she wouldn't be overheard. "But the Petton wedding cake she's working on is quite modest, really, not the sort that would require extraordinary amounts of sugar work." Miss Marple made a mental note of this information. In her experience, people who ordered supplies in unusual quantities often had purposes beyond their stated intentions. And yesterday evening, was Miss Darren working late? "Oh yes, quite late. I stayed until nearly 6 hours to help with the day's cleanup, and she was still boiling sugar when I left. The smell was quite strong. You know how it carries when sugar reaches the hard crack stage. Hard crack. The term that Connie herself had used so precisely when describing her work. Miss Marple was beginning to understand that the confectioner's expertise with sugar temperatures might extend beyond mere decorative work. She excused herself from the shop and made her way back into the bakehouse, where Edwin was listlessly checking the morning's loaves. The bread was golden and properly risen, but there was no satisfaction in his manner as he performed the familiar tasks. "Edwin," she said gently, "I've been thinking about what Kitty mentioned, Ned's concerns about the sugar inventory. Had you noticed any discrepancies yourself?" Edwin looked up from the loaves with the expression of a man trying to focus on practical matters despite his grief. He'd mentioned something about the books not balancing. Sugar usage seemed higher than what the sales would account for. "I told him we'd look into it properly after the Petton wedding was finished. Didn't want to upset Miss Darren's work schedule. And the glucose? Was that something you normally stocked?" "Never used it before Miss Darren requested it. She said it was for special techniques, professional finishing work that required particular properties. I didn't question it. She knows her trade better than I do." Miss Marple moved to Connie's workstation, where the confectioner was carefully applying final touches to a batch of sugar roses. The work was indeed exquisite, each petal formed with a precision that came from years of practice. But on the bench beside her main work area sat several small tools that seemed oddly placed. A piping bag lay in the wastebasket, its paper cone split and discarded. But when Miss Marple retrieved it with a handkerchief, she noticed that the interior was coated not with the white residue of royal icing, but with the same amber varnish she had observed elsewhere. The substance had hardened to a glass-like consistency that would have made the bag useless for its intended purpose. "Miss Darren," she said conversationally, "this piping bag seems to have been used for something other than icing." Connie glanced up from her roses with an expression of mild annoyance at the interruption. "Sugar work requires experimentation, Miss Marple. Sometimes one must test different temperatures and consistencies. Not every attempt is successful. Of course. And that sugar thermometer there, such a precise instrument. I imagine temperature control is absolutely critical in your work." "Essential," Connie agreed curtly. "The difference of even 5 can mean the difference between success and failure in advanced sugar work, Missy." Marple noted that the thermometer currently registered precisely at the hard crack range, 305 orders, though no sugar was currently being heated. Either it had been used very recently, or it had been deliberately set to that reading. On Connie's wrist, barely visible beneath the lace cuff of her sleeve, Miss Marple glimpsed what appeared to be a fresh scald mark. When she commented on it with apparent concern, Connie dismissed it as yesterday's carelessness with her usual composure. But Miss Marple was beginning to see a pattern in these small details. The precisely placed kettle, the amber residue on the wall peg, the discarded piping bag, the thermometer reading, and now a fresh burn that Connie claimed was a day old. Each element by itself might be explained away, but together they suggested a level of recent sugar work that went far beyond the preparation of simple glazes or decorative roses. As she prepared to leave the bakehouse, Miss Marple took one final look at the scene where poor Ned had been found. The precise timing of his death, according to his own careful schedule, was beginning to seem less like tragic coincidence and more like deliberate calculation. Someone, it appeared, had known exactly when and where Ned Tranta would be standing at 20 minutes past 4 that morning. Chapter 5. Twine on the Ceiling. Hooked and Lady Bantry arrived at Tranta's bakehouse shortly after 9:00, drawn by the news that had spread through St. Mary Mead with the efficiency that only village gossip could achieve. Dolly Bantry was a woman of considerable energy and little patience for what she considered official nonsense, and Inspector Slack's hasty conclusion about poor Ned's death had struck her as precisely that sort of bureaucratic blindness. "Jane," she announced to Miss Marple with characteristic directness, I've just spoken to Dr. Haydock at the post office, and he's distinctly uncomfortable about Slack's accident theory. Says the injury pattern doesn't match a simple fall, and the inspector wouldn't listen to medical evidence. Typical of the man. Miss Marple glanced toward the bakehouse, where Edwin could be seen moving slowly through his afternoon preparations. While Inspector Slack remained conspicuously absent, perhaps we might take a closer look at the scene while there's no official interference, she suggested mildly. The two ladies made their way into the bakehouse, with the quiet determination of women who had solved more mysteries than the local constabulary cared to acknowledge. My afternoon light streamed through the windows at a different angle than the morning sun had done, illuminating details that had been shadowed earlier. Miss Marple directed Dolly's attention immediately to the ceiling hook that had troubled her from the beginning. Notice the fresh scoring on the metal. Dolly, something has passed over that hook recently under considerable tension. Lady Bantry, who had grown up on a country estate and understood mechanical principles as well as any man, examined the hook with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating pulley systems and hoisting equipment. Rope burn, she pronounced definitively. And recent, too. See how bright the metal is where it's been rubbed? Whatever passed over this hook was pulled tight, enough to leave permanent marks hanging. From the hook were several strands of coarse twine, the sort used for bundling and tying, throughout the bakehouse. But these fibers were stiffened and discolored, as if they had been dipped in something that had subsequently hardened. When Miss Marple touched them gently with a handkerchief, they felt brittle and gave off that same faint burnt sugar scent she had detected elsewhere. Most peculiar, she murmured. Twine doesn't normally acquire that sort of rigidity from ordinary use. They traced an imaginary line from the ceiling hook to the spot where the long peel had been found. The distance was approximately 8 feet, and the angle would have allowed something suspended from the hook to swing in a controlled arc that would terminate precisely at the oven line where poor Ned had been working. Lady Bantry examined the peel handle with the thoroughness of someone who had spent years managing estate equipment. Jane, look at this mark on the wood. It's not random damage. It's the impression of something wound around the handle in a very specific pattern. See how regular the spacing is, and there's only one such mark, which suggests whatever made it was applied and then removed quickly. Miss Marple nodded, noting also that the mark was positioned at exactly the point where maximum leverage could be achieved. Someone with knowledge of mechanical principles had chosen that placement with considerable care. The distance from the hook to the handle would require approximately 8 feet of line, she calculated, and if something heavy were attached to the free end of the peel, the resulting swing would have tremendous force. They moved to examine the area around the proving cupboard, where the kettle still sat on its gas ring in that peculiarly precise position Miss Marple had noted earlier. The wooden door of the cupboard showed the warping and discoloration of years of steam exposure, but wedged into a crack in the door frame was a small wooden peg that seemed to serve as a stop. This peg appears to be positioned so that the door catches against it at a specific angle, Miss Marple observed. Not fully open, but open just enough to allow someone to check the contents without fully disturbing the proving environment. Lady Bantry tested the door mechanism, and if someone knew exactly when young Ned would open this door, which they would, given his methodical schedule, they could predict his position to the minute. The kettle's placement was even more intriguing upon closer examination. It had been positioned so that its steam would rise in a direct line toward the wall peg where Miss Marple had found the amber residue. The angle was too precise to be accidental, and the gas flame beneath it had been adjusted to maintain a gentle but steady output of vapor. Steam, Miss Marple mused, is often used in confectionery work to control crystallization and maintain working temperatures, but it can also be used to soften hardened sugar. they discovered, wedged behind the proving cupboard where it would not be immediately noticed, a 7B weight from the bread scales, the sort used for measuring large quantities of flour and ingredients. The weight showed a fresh dent on one side, as if it had recently struck something hard, and there were traces of flour on its surface that suggested it had been moved from its usual storage location. A weight this size, dropped from the height of that ceiling hook, would generate enormous force, Lady Bantry calculated. Quite enough to drive a peel handle in a devastating arc. Miss Marple was beginning to see the mechanism with clarity. Someone with expertise in sugar work could create a timing device using hard cracked caramel. A loop of twine dipped in sugar heated to exactly the right temperature would harden into a temporary but strong connection. Steam applied to the join would gradually soften it until it released under tension. Ingenious, Lady Bantry admitted grudgingly, and completely dependent on precise timing and temperature control. The sort of expertise that comes from years of professional confectionery work. They examined the wall peg once more, noting how the amber residue was positioned at exactly the height where steam from the kettle would encounter it most effectively. The remains of the sugar loop were still visible, though deteriorated by the morning's humidity. The sequence becomes clear, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. A line runs from the ceiling hook to the peel handle, held in tension by a sugar loop created at the wall peg. The 7B weight is attached to the free end of the peel, creating a spring-loaded mechanism. The kettle is positioned to direct steam at the sugar joint. When poor Ned opens the proving cupboard at his scheduled time, the softened sugar gives way, the weight falls, and the peel swings with lethal force. Lady Bantry tested the door mechanism again, noting how the wooden peg would ensure that Ned stood in exactly the right position for the mechanism to be effective. The timing would have to be calculated to the minute. Someone would need to know his schedule precisely. And someone did. Miss Marple replied quietly. Young Ned was nothing if not methodical. His schedule was posted where anyone in the bakehouse could see it, and he followed it religiously. They stood in contemplative silence, surrounded by the honest smells of bread and flour, trying to reconcile the domestic tranquility of the bakehouse with the cold calculation required for such an elaborate mechanism. It was a contradiction that spoke to the complexity of human nature, the ability to use nurturing skills for destructive purposes. The question remains, Lady Bantry said finally, who had both the expertise to create such a device and the motive to use it against poor Ned? Miss Marple's gaze traveled to the corner where Connie Darren worked at her delicate sugar roses, her movements precise and controlled, her expression revealing nothing of whatever thoughts occupied her mind. The confectioner possessed all the technical knowledge required, certainly, but knowledge alone did not constitute proof of guilt. We must be very careful. Dolly, she cautioned. Suspicion based on capability is a dangerous foundation for accusation. We need to understand not just who could have done this, but why anyone would have wanted to. As they prepared to leave the bakehouse, Miss Marple took one final look at the ceiling hook with its telltale scoring and the dangling remains of sugar-stiffened twine. The mechanism had been dismantled, but its components told a clear story to anyone who knew how to read them. Someone in Tranta's bakehouse had possessed both the skill and the determination to turn the tools of their trade into instruments of murder. Chapter 6. Ledger. Sugar that didn't add up. The post office in St. Mary Mead served as more than merely a place for collecting letters and purchasing stamps. In the capable hands of postmistress Nora Pike, it functioned as an unofficial clearinghouse for village information, a repository of local commerce records, and a discreet observation post from which the daily transactions of the community could be monitored with remarkable thoroughness. Miss Marple had known Nora Pike for the better part of 20 years, and she understood that the postmistress possessed an almost supernatural ability to recall the details of every delivery, every purchase order, and every business arrangement that passed through her domain. If anyone could shed light on the recent sugar acquisitions at Tranta's bakehouse, it would be Nora. Sugar, you say? Nora adjusted her spectacles and consulted the delivery book that lay open on her counter. Oh yes, quite an unusual order that was. Miss Darren came in Tuesday morning, day before yesterday, asking about expedited delivery for a substantial quantity of granulated sugar and a drum of glucose syrup. Said she had a wedding commission that required rather more elaborate sugar work than usual. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. The Petton wedding, I suppose. That's what she mentioned, though I must say, it seemed rather a lot of supplies for what I understood to be a modest affair. Mrs. Petton isn't one for ostentation, you know. But then, I'm no expert in confectionery requirements. The tone suggested that while she might not be an expert, she was certainly an observant recorder of inconsistencies. And the delivery was arranged through Mr. Purvis at Much Benham Mill? Indeed, he signed the authorization as a business courtesy, though I noticed he seemed rather eager to accommodate Miss Darren's request. Waived the usual credit verification, approved immediate delivery, even offered to transport the glucose drum himself rather than wait for the regular delivery van. This information struck Miss Marple as worthy of further consideration. In her experience, business favors were rarely extended without some expectation of reciprocal advantage. How helpful of Mr. Purvis. I imagine Miss Darren was grateful for such accommodation. She thanked him quite properly, though I wouldn't say she seemed particularly surprised by his willingness to assist, almost as if such arrangements were, well, not unusual between them. Miss Marple made her way from the post office to Tranta's bakehouse with a growing sense that the sugar discrepancies Ned had noticed were part of a more complex pattern than simple inventory mismanagement. The afternoon sun slanted through the bakehouse windows, illuminating Edwin as he worked mechanically through his preparations for the following day's baking. Edwin, she said gently, I wonder if you might show me the ledger where you record your supply purchases. I'm trying to understand the scope of young Ned's concerns about the inventory. Edwin retrieved a substantial bound book from beneath the counter, its pages filled with careful entries in various hands. The recent entries showed Edwin's own methodical script, but in the margins were Ned's pencil notations, small crosses, question marks, and calculations that told the story of a young man growing increasingly concerned about discrepancies in the accounts. The sugar entries were particularly revealing. Over the past 2 months, purchases had increased substantially, but the corresponding sales records showed no proportional rise in items that would require heavy sugar usage, even accounting for Connie Darren's confectionery work. The consumption appeared to exceed legitimate business needs by a considerable margin. Ned had been tracking this for several weeks, Edwin explained, his voice hollow with grief and confusion. He said the numbers didn't balance, that someone was either taking sugar for personal use or substituting cheaper ingredients and pocketing the difference. Miss Marple examined Ned's careful notations more closely. Besides several entries, he had written small calculations comparing the theoretical sugar requirements for specific items with the actual amounts consumed. The discrepancies were significant and consistent, suggesting systematic rather than accidental irregularities. Did he share these concerns with Miss Darren? He mentioned something about checking the finishing procedures, making sure everything was being done according to proper standards. I think he was trying to approach it diplomatically. Didn't want to make direct accusations without absolute proof. But Ned's diplomatic approach, Miss Marple reflected, might have been precisely what alerted someone to his investigation. A methodical young man asking careful questions about sugar usage would certainly attract attention from anyone engaged in systematic theft. She turned to a page that showed the most recent entries, including the substantial purchase Nora Pike had described. The quantities were indeed remarkable, far more than any reasonable wedding cake commission would require, even one involving elaborate sugarwork. Edwin. This glucose purchase, was that something Miss Darren had requested before? Never. She'd always insisted on pure cane sugar for her work, said it gave superior results. When she suddenly requested glucose, I was surprised. But she explained it was for special techniques she wanted to try. Miss Marple understood that glucose, while cheaper than cane sugar, produced different crystallization properties when heated. An experienced confectioner might use it for specific applications, but substituting it for cane sugar in standard glazing work would be detectable to anyone with trained palate or technical knowledge. The ledger showed that Alec Purvis had indeed signed the authorization for the recent purchases, and his signature appeared on several other entries over the past months for a flour mill representative. He seemed remarkably involved in the bakehouse's sugar procurement. How long has Mr. Purvis been handling your supply arrangements? About 6 months now. The previous representative retired and Purvis took over the account. He's been quite accommodating about credit terms and special orders. Miss Marple noted that the irregularities in sugar consumption appeared to coincide roughly with Purvis's involvement in the account. The timing might be coincidental, but in her experience, coincidences in matters of money were often nothing of the sort. She examined Ned's final entries made the day before his death. His handwriting showed increasing concern, with several items circled and question marks growing more frequent. On the margin of the last page, he had written a single word followed by a question mark. Partnership. The implication was troubling. If Ned had begun to suspect some form of collusion between Connie Darren and Alec Purvis, he would have been in a position to expose not just petty theft, but a more serious fraud involving falsified records and systematic deception of Edwin's trust. Edwin, did Ned mention planning to discuss these concerns with anyone besides yourself? He said he wanted to have all the facts straight before raising the matter formally. Mentioned something about wanting to be fair to Miss Darren, giving her a chance to explain before involving outside authorities. The young man's sense of fairness, Miss Marple realized, had likely sealed his fate. By alerting Connie to his suspicions while continuing his investigation, he had given her both warning and motive to prevent his discoveries from becoming public. She closed the ledger thoughtfully, her mind working through the implications of what she had learned. The sugar thefts provided clear financial motive, while Ned's scheduled confrontation with his father provided precise timing for urgent action. Someone who knew his methodical nature could predict exactly when and where he would be vulnerable. "Edwin," she said carefully, "I think it might be wise to secure this ledger somewhere safe. Young Ned's observations may prove to be more significant than anyone realized." As she prepared to leave the bakehouse, Miss Marple glanced toward Connie Darren's workstation, where the confectioner continued her delicate sugar work with unperturbed concentration. The woman's composure was remarkable, considering that her systematic theft had been discovered, and her victim had died so conveniently before he could expose her crimes. But composure, Miss Marple had learned, was often the most damning evidence of all. Innocence rarely maintained such perfect calm in the face of tragedy. While guilt had every reason to appear untroubled by consequences, it had carefully arranged to avoid. Chapter 7. Alibi at 4:30. The precise timing of events at Tranta's bakehouse had always been a matter of considerable importance to the success of the daily operations. Bread making, as Edwin often explained to those who inquired about his craft, was a business governed by the clock as much as by the thermometer. Doughs proved for exact periods, ovens must be heated to specific temperatures at predetermined times, and the entire elaborate dance of commercial baking depended upon every participant knowing precisely where they should be at any given moment. This devotion to punctuality, Miss Marple reflected as she sat in her garden that evening, made the events of the morning both more comprehensible and more sinister. In a household where everyone followed rigid schedules, it would be possible to predict with remarkable accuracy where each person would be at 20 minutes. Past 4 in the morning, the question of alibis in such an environment became particularly interesting when everyone had designated tasks at specific times. The absence of an alibi became as significant as its presence. Edwin's movements during the crucial period were easily verified. Mrs. Clement from next door had observed him loading the delivery cart in the yard from her kitchen window, where she had been preparing an early breakfast for her husband's shift work. Her testimony placed him clearly away from the bakehouse interior from 4:10 until 25, when the cry had brought him running. Kitty Larkin's whereabouts were equally well documented. She had arrived at precisely 6 as was her invariable custom, and had immediately begun arranging the shop front for the morning's trade. The milk boy had seen her through the window, and the constable on his morning rounds had noted her presence as he passed at 6:15. But the alibis of Connie Darren and Alec Purvis required more careful examination. Miss Darren claimed to have been in her room above the confectionery workspace, putting finishing touches on sugar flowers for the Petton wedding cake. It was work that required delicate handling and could not be rushed, she explained, particularly in the early morning hours, when the humidity was most favorable for such intricate tasks. Yet Miss Marple had noticed certain inconsistencies in this account. Sugar roses, as she had learned from her inquiries among other confectioners in neighboring villages, were typically created well in advance of their intended use. The delicate structures needed time to dry and harden properly, and any competent professional would complete them days before the actual assembly of the wedding cake. Moreover, the optimal humidity for sugar work was generally found in the late evening or very early morning hours, before the day's activities had raised the moisture content of the air. If Miss Darren had indeed been working on sugar flowers at 4:20 in the morning, she would more likely have been creating new pieces rather than applying finishing touches to existing ones. The question of Alec Purvis's presence was even more troubling. His claim to have visited the bakehouse the previous evening and then returned to Much Benham was supported only by his own assertion and the testimony of a toll-keeper, who recalled someone matching his description passing through the village checkpoint around 11 but the toll-keeper's recollection, when Miss Marple had taken the trouble to verify it through discreet inquiries, proved to be less certain than Purvis had suggested. The man recalled a motor car of the appropriate description, but could not swear to the identity of its driver in the darkness of the late evening. More significantly, the distance between Much Benham and St. Mary Mead could be covered in less than an hour by motor car, even allowing for the poor condition of the country roads. It would have been entirely possible for Purvis to return to the bakehouse in the early morning hours without being observed by anyone who might later contradict his alibi. The timing of the mechanism that had killed poor Ned was particularly revealing in this regard. Someone had needed to position the kettle, adjust the gas flame, and ensure that the steam would be directed at the sugar loop at precisely the right moment to achieve the desired softening effect. Based on Miss Marple's careful reconstruction of the device, the process would have required approximately 15 to 20 minutes to complete. The sugar loop would need to be heated to the proper temperature, allowed to cool and harden, then subjected to steam for a calculated period before reaching the point of failure. This meant that whoever had set the mechanism in motion would have needed to begin their preparations no later than 4 in the morning, working with the knowledge that Ned would arrive at the proving cupboard at exactly 27 minutes past the hour. Edwin's presence in the yard provided him with a clear alibi for the crucial period, but it also ensured that he would not accidentally discover the preparations being made inside the bakehouse. Someone familiar with the morning routine would have known that Edwin's attention would be focused on loading the delivery cart during the critical 15-minute window Kitty's later arrival. eliminated her from consideration entirely, while her emotional distress at Ned's death appeared entirely genuine. Young people in love, Miss Marple had observed, rarely succeeded in concealing their true feelings when tragedy struck their beloved. But Connie Darren's claimed presence upstairs in her private room could not be verified by any independent witness. Her work area was positioned so that she could move between her room and the main bakehouse, without being observed from the yard where Edwin was working. The physical evidence strongly suggested that whoever had constructed the fatal mechanism possessed detailed knowledge of sugar work and considerable familiarity with the bakehouse layout. They would also need to know Ned's precise schedule and have access to the necessary materials during the early morning hours. Miss Darren's expertise with hard crack sugar temperatures was well established, as was her access to all areas of the bakehouse at any hour. Her recent orders for unusual quantities of sugar and glucose provided both materials and motive for the systematic theft that Ned had been investigating. Most damning of all, her remarkably composed demeanor in the aftermath of the tragedy suggested a degree of emotional preparation that was difficult to reconcile with innocent surprise at an unexpected accident. The question of Purvis's involvement remained more speculative, but his unusual accommodations regarding credit and delivery arrangements, combined with his convenient absence during the crucial morning hours, painted a picture of someone who had every reason to prevent Ned's discoveries from becoming public knowledge. As Miss Marple prepared for bed that evening, she reflected on the curious nature of alibis in cases where the actual crime was committed by mechanical means rather than direct human action. The person who had killed Ned Tranta had been nowhere near their victim when the fatal blow was struck. Yet their guilt was no less certain for being accomplished at a distance. Tomorrow, she decided, it would be necessary to test her theories more directly. The time for careful observation and discreet inquiry was drawing to a close. Chapter 8. The Piping Bag, Not for Icing. The following morning brought unseasonably warm weather to St. Mary Mead, with a humid stillness that made even the early hours feel oppressive. Miss Marple arrived at Tranta's bakehouse shortly after 7 WOW, ostensibly to purchase her daily bread, but in reality, to pursue certain observations that had occurred to her during a largely sleepless night. The bakehouse showed the subdued activity of a business attempting to maintain its routines despite tragedy. Edwin moved through his tasks with mechanical precision, while Kitty served customers with red-rimmed eyes and forced cheerfulness. Only Connie Darren seemed entirely unaffected by the previous day's events, working at her bench with the same methodical concentration she had always displayed. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe the confectioner's workspace without appearing to do so. The tools of sugar work were arranged with military precision: thermometer, copper pans of various sizes, wooden spoons worn smooth by years of use, and a collection of piping bags in different stages of preparation. Professional confectioners typically maintained several bags simultaneously, each dedicated to specific types of icing or decorative work. The bags themselves were formed from parchment paper, twisted into precise cones that could be fitted with metal tips for detailed piping work. In the wastebasket beside Connie's workstation, Miss Marple had previously noticed a discarded piping bag that bore the telltale amber staining of hardened sugar rather than the white residue of royal icing. This morning she observed Connie preparing a fresh bag, and the process revealed details that had not been apparent before. The confectioner's movements were practiced and efficient, but there was something furtive about the way she glanced around before disposing of certain materials. When she thought herself unobserved, she retrieved the amber-stained bag from the wastebasket and examined it carefully before wrapping it in brown paper and placing it in her personal basket. Miss Marple found this behavior curious. Professional bakers rarely saved failed or contaminated equipment, particularly items as inexpensive as paper piping bags. The decision to preserve and remove evidence of unsuccessful sugar work suggested that the bag held significance beyond its apparent function. During a moment when Connie stepped away from her workstation, Miss Marple approached the area with the casual air of someone admiring the confectionery skill. The thermometer that lay beside the sugar pan registered exactly 10 degrees, the upper range of hard crack temperature, and well beyond what would be required for simple glazing work. More telling still was the condition of Connie's hands. Despite her claims of having worked extensively with hot sugar the previous evening, her fingers showed remarkably few signs of the small burns and scaling that inevitably accompanied such work. However, on her left wrist, partially concealed by the lace cuff of her sleeve, was a fresh scald mark that appeared far too recent to match her account of yesterday's activities. The burn pattern was distinctive, a narrow, elongated mark that suggested contact with a thin stream of very hot liquid. Miss Marple had observed similar injuries in her own kitchen when accidentally touching the spout of a kettle from which steam was emerging under pressure. Miss Darren, she ventured conversationally, that burn on your wrist looks quite painful. I do hope it's healing properly. Connie's hand moved instinctively to cover the mark. A careless moment yesterday evening. One learns to be more careful with experience. But accidents still happen, Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though she noticed that the scald showed none of the settling and color changes that would be expected from a day-old injury. The redness was too fresh, the edges too sharp for a burn sustained on Tuesday evening. The positioning of the kettle continued to intrigue her. Throughout the morning, she observed that Connie made several minor adjustments to its placement, each time ensuring that the spout was angled toward the wall where the amber-stained peg was located. The gas flame beneath was maintained at a precise level, not high enough to produce vigorous boiling, but sufficient to generate a steady stream of steam. When Dr. Haydock arrived to check on Edwin's condition, Miss Marple seized the opportunity to draw him aside for a quiet consultation. Doctor, in your medical opinion, what sort of implement might produce a burn of the type Miss Darren has on her wrist? He glanced discreetly toward the confectioner before responding. Interesting pattern. I'd say contact with pressurized steam, the sort that might escape from a kettle spout or similar opening. The width and depth suggest brief but intense contact with very hot vapor. And the age of the injury, no more than 12 hours, I'd estimate. Certainly not the day-old burn she claims it to be. This confirmation supported Miss Marple's growing certainty about the sequence of events that had led to Ned's death. The burn represented physical evidence of Connie's involvement in positioning the steam source that had ultimately triggered the fatal mechanism. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple noticed that Alec Purvis had arrived and was conducting what appeared to be routine business with Edwin. However, his conversations with Connie Darren were notably brief and conducted in voices too low to be overheard. The flower representative's manner was nervous, and he frequently glanced toward the door as if concerned about being observed. During one such exchange, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe their interaction more closely. Purvis handed Connie a small envelope, which she immediately placed in her apron pocket without examining its contents. The transaction had the furtive quality of people disposing of evidence rather than conducting legitimate business. When Purvis prepared to leave, Connie accompanied him to his motor car carrying her personal basket with its carefully wrapped contents. Miss Marple watched from the shop window as they engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion beside the vehicle. The confectioner's demeanor throughout these exchanges was markedly different from her usual composed efficiency. There was an urgency to her movements, a tension in her bearing that suggested someone operating under considerable pressure. Returning to her workstation, Connie began preparations for what she described as additional sugar work for the Petton wedding. However, Miss Marple noted that the quantities being prepared far exceeded what any single wedding cake could reasonably require. Moreover, the temperature readings on her thermometer continued to register in the hard crack range, well beyond what would be necessary for decorative flowers or standard glazing work. Someone with Connie's professional expertise would not maintain such extreme temperatures without specific purpose. The pattern of evidence was becoming increasingly clear. The amber-stained piping bag, the precisely positioned kettle, the fresh burn mark, and the furtive exchanges with Purvis all pointed toward a carefully orchestrated deception that had culminated in murder. Miss Marple realized that the time for discreet observation was rapidly drawing to a close. If justice was to be served for poor Ned's death, more direct action would soon be necessary. The tools of the confectioner's trade, she reflected, could create beauty or destruction with equal efficiency. It was the intention behind their use that determined whether they served life or death. Chapter 9. The Hard Crack Test. Inspector. Slack's return to Tranta's bakehouse that afternoon was prompted by his desire to close the case officially and file his final report, declaring Ned's death an unfortunate accident. He arrived with the satisfied air of a man who considered his conclusions beyond reasonable dispute and his paperwork nearly complete. Right then, he announced to the assembled occupants of the bakehouse, "I've spoken with the coroner, and we're agreed that this was a straightforward case of workplace misadventure. Tragic, certainly, but not criminal. The matter is closed." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing the afternoon's activities while appearing to knit in the corner, looked up from her needles with mild interest. "How efficient of you, Inspector." "I do admire the certainty of official conclusions." Lady Bantry, who had arrived some minutes earlier with the stated intention of ordering a cake for her garden party, raised an eyebrow at this exchange. She had known Jane Marple for far too many years to mistake that particular tone of gentle observation for mere idle comment. "Though I confess," Miss Marple continued in the same conversational manner, "I've been puzzling over some of the technical aspects of young Ned's accident. Perhaps you might indulge an old woman's curiosity about the mechanics of what occurred." Slack's expression suggested that indulging old women's curiosities ranked rather low on his list of preferred activities, but the presence of Lady Bantry, who wielded considerable influence in local affairs, encouraged him toward tolerance. "What sort of mechanics?" he asked with poorly concealed impatience. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and approached Edwin's work area. "Well, I've been wondering about the behavior of various materials under heat and steam. Sugar work in particular seems to involve such precise temperature control." She addressed Edwin directly. "My dear man, might I borrow a small saucepan and perhaps a spoonful of granulated sugar? I should like to demonstrate something to the inspector." Edwin, grateful for any distraction from his grief, obligingly provided the requested materials. Miss Marple placed the pan on the gas ring and added the sugar with the careful movements of someone who had spent decades managing domestic tasks with precision. "You see, Inspector, I've learned that sugar heated to what confectioners call the hard crack stage becomes quite remarkable in its properties. Miss Darren has been most educational about the various temperatures and their effects." Connie Darren, who had been working quietly at her bench, looked up with a weariness that had not been present in her demeanor previously. "Sugar work is indeed precise, Miss Marple, though I'm not certain what relevance it has to poor Ned's accident." "Oh, but I think it has considerable relevance," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, stirring the sugar as it began to melt and darken. "You see, when sugar reaches precisely the right temperature, around 305 degrees, I believe you mentioned, it can be used to create temporary but quite strong connections." She produced a length of baker's twine from her reticule, and when the sugar had reached the appropriate consistency, dipped a small loop of the cord into the amber syrup. The sugar coated the fibers immediately, hardening into a glossy, rigid connection as it cooled. "Fascinating," she murmured, holding up the result for inspection. "Rather like a temporary glue, wouldn't you say?" Lady Bantry moved closer to examine the demonstration. "Jane, what exactly are you showing us?" Miss Marple tied one end of the sugared loop to the handle of Lady Bantry's parasol, then passed the other end over a convenient peg on the bakehouse wall. The arrangement created a simple pulley system with the parasol suspended by the sugar-hardened connection. "Now," she continued, adjusting the kettle so that its steam rose directly toward the sugar joint. "Observe what happens when steam is applied to our little connection." The effect was remarkably swift. Within moments, the sugar began to soften under the influence of the hot vapor. The glossy hardness gave way to pliability, and suddenly the loop released entirely, allowing the parasol to drop with a sharp snap. "How very convenient," Miss Marple observed. "A timing device that requires no clockwork, no fuses, no complicated mechanisms, simply knowledge of sugar temperatures, and the patience to wait for steam to do its work." Inspector Slack stared at the demonstration with growing comprehension. "Are you suggesting that someone used this sugar business, to create some sort of trap?" "I'm suggesting, Inspector, that someone with considerable expertise in confectionery techniques could use such methods to create a device that would function with remarkable precision, particularly if they knew exactly when and where their intended victim would be positioned." She moved to the ceiling, hook that had troubled her from the beginning, pointing out the bright scoring marks on the metal. A line from here to the peel handle, held in tension by a sugar loop, with sufficient weight attached to create devastating force when the connection failed. Connie Darren had gone very pale, but her voice remained steady. "This is all speculation, Miss Marple. You have no proof that any such device was actually constructed, do I?" Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. The amber residue on the wall peg, hardened exactly as sugar behaves when heated to hard crack temperature. The fresh burn on your wrist, sustained when you position the kettle to direct steam at precisely the right angle. The piping bag in your basket, stained with the evidence of your temperature tests. She turned to address the room generally. "You see, creating such a device would require considerable experimentation to ensure proper timing. One would need to test various thicknesses of sugar coating, different steam pressures, precise positioning of all elements. The evidence of such testing would be quite unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for." Dr. Haydock, who had arrived during the demonstration, examined the remains of Miss Marple's sugar loop with professional interest. "The timing would be remarkably predictable, wouldn't it? Sugar softens at consistent rates under specific conditions." "Precisely, Doctor. Someone familiar with professional confectionery techniques would know exactly how long such a connection would hold under steam of a given temperature and pressure. With young Ned's methodical schedule, the timing could be calculated to the minute." Inspector Slack's expression had progressed from skepticism through confusion to dawning understanding. "You're saying this was planned, deliberate?" "I'm saying, Inspector, that the evidence suggests a carefully constructed mechanism designed to kill young Ned at a predetermined time, while providing the appearance of accidental death. The killer needed expertise in sugar work, knowledge of Ned's precise routine, and access to the bakehouse during the crucial preparation period." Connie Darren stood very straight beside her workstation, her composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of Miss Marple's methodical exposition. The sugar thermometer on her bench still registered exactly 310 degrees, and the kettle continued to emit its carefully directed stream of steam. "The question remaining," Miss Marple said quietly, "is whether the person responsible for this ingenious but horrible crime will continue to maintain their innocence in the face of such overwhelming evidence. The Bakehouse fell silent except for the gentle hissing of steam from the kettle and the soft tick of the clock that had governed poor Ned's final fatal schedule. Chapter 10, Bakehouse Sugar Loop. Falling Weight. Miss Marple stood beside the oven line where poor Ned had met his death, her hands folded quietly before her as she surveyed the scene with the calm authority of someone who had unraveled the final threads of a complex deception. "Perhaps," she said gently, "I might explain exactly what happened in this bakehouse yesterday morning, so that we may all understand the true nature of this tragedy." Inspector Slack, his earlier confidence considerably shaken by the sugar demonstration, nodded reluctantly. Lady Bantry positioned herself where she could observe both Miss Marple's exposition and Connie Darren's reactions, while Edwin sat heavily on a flour sack, his weathered face gray with the growing realization that his son's death had been no accident. Miss Marple moved to the ceiling hook with its telltale scoring. The mechanism was ingenious in its simplicity. A length of twine ran from this hook to the handle of the long peel, held in tension by a small loop of sugar hardened to precisely the right consistency. The 7B scale weight was attached to the free end of the peel handle, creating a spring-loaded device of considerable force. She traced the imaginary line from hook to peel with careful precision. When the sugar loop failed under the influence of steam, the weight would fall, causing the peel to swing in a controlled arc that would strike anyone standing at the proving cupboard with devastating effect. Dr. Haydock examined the peel handle once more, noting the cord impression and the faint scorch marks. The leverage would multiply the force tremendously. A 7B weight dropping from that height would drive the peel with the impact of a sledgehammer. Indeed, Doctor. But the true cleverness lay in the timing mechanism. The kettle was positioned to direct steam at the sugar loop, which would soften gradually until it reached the point of failure. Someone with expert knowledge of sugar behavior could calculate this timing with remarkable precision. Miss Marple moved to demonstrate the positioning. The proving cupboard door was wedged to ensure that young Ned would stand in exactly the right position when he made his scheduled check at 4:27. The killer knew his habits well enough to predict his location to the minute. Connie Darren's composure had been steadily deteriorating throughout the explanation, but she made one final attempt at denial. "This is all theoretical, Miss Marple. You cannot prove that any such device was actually constructed." Miss Marple regarded her with the gentle but implacable gaze of someone who had seen too much human nature to be deceived by protestation. "Can't I, Miss Darren?" The amber bead on the wall peg, containing fibers of baker's twine. The piping bag you so carefully preserved and attempted to remove, stained with hard cracked sugar rather than icing. The thermometer reading that has remained constant at 310°F since yesterday morning. The fresh burn on your wrist from positioning the steam source. She paused, allowing the weight of evidence to settle. But most damning of all, your remarkable composure in the face of tragedy. Grief has its own signature, Miss Darren, and yours has been notably absent. Inspector Slack found his voice at last. The motive being this sugar theft business, young Ned had discovered. Indeed, Inspector. Miss Darren had been systematically stealing sugar and substituting cheaper glucose. With Mr. Purvis's assistance in arranging deliveries and falsifying records, when Ned's investigation threatened to expose their partnership, elimination became necessary. Edwin looked up with the expression of a man struggling to comprehend how trust could be so thoroughly violated. "But why, Miss Darren? If you needed money, we could have discussed arrangements." For the first time, genuine emotion flickered across Connie's features. "You don't understand what it's like, depending on the charity of others, renting space like a tenant. I wanted independence, security. The sugar sales would have given me enough to establish my own premises. So, you killed my son for the price of a few pounds of sugar. It wasn't supposed to." She stopped herself, but the admission hung in the air like smoke. Miss Marple nodded sadly. It wasn't supposed to be discovered, you mean? You calculated that an apparent accident would end the investigation before Ned could present his evidence to his father this morning. Lady Bantry had been listening with growing indignation. And Mr. Purvis, what was his role in this business? Essential but cowardly, Miss Marple replied. He provided the means for the theft, but distanced himself from the consequences. I suspect his nervousness this morning indicates he had some notion of what Miss Darren might do, but lacked the courage to prevent it. Connie Darren stood very straight beside her workstation, her hand steady despite everything. When she spoke, her voice carried the calm precision that had characterized all her work. It was only meant to teach him, she said quietly. Young men don't understand how difficult it is for women to make their way in the world. Inspector Slack's face hardened with understanding. You're confessing to murder, Miss Darren. She met his gaze without flinching. I'm confessing to protecting myself from ruin. Ned would have destroyed everything I'd worked for, all for the sake of his precious honesty. His honesty, Edwin said with quiet dignity, was worth more than all the sugar in England. As Inspector Slack moved to take Connie Darren into custody, Miss Marple gathered her belongings with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice served, though not without sadness for the waste of it all. Later, as Lady Bantry broke a still warm roll in the garden of Gossington Hall, she shivered despite the afternoon warmth. Sugar of all things. Jane, Miss Marple folded her knitting with practiced movements. Yes, my dear Dolly, kitchens are full of useful things. It is the uses that determine whether they serve good or evil purposes. She paused thoughtfully. And young people who maintain precise schedules are indeed angels to the truth. Poor Ned's methodical nature both revealed the crime and sealed his fate. The bakehouse of St. Mary Mead would continue its ancient rhythms. But the trust that had made such work possible had been broken by greed and ambition. In Miss Marple's experience, that was often the most lasting tragedy of all.